It was the cold morning of April 5th, 1531, when the sound of hammering echoed from the courtyard of Smithfield in London. Workmen were assembling something strange for an execution. Not the wooden gallows or a block for beheading, but an iron tripod that stood over a freshly dug fire pit. Beneath it, a massive cauldron was being hoisted into place, its blackened sides already streaked with soot from earlier testing. A bitter wind carried the smell of pitch and burning charcoal. People whispered that today, justice would boil. Richard Roos, a man in his early 30s, stood shackled in a dark cell beneath the Tower of London. He had been the cook in the household of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, a man trusted by King Henry VIII himself. Only weeks earlier, Roos had been accused of committing a crime so vile. Parliament passed a special law to make his punishment possible. According to witnesses, he had poisoned a pot of porridge prepared for the bishop's household. Two people had died after eating it. The bishop himself had survived, but the act was seen as an assault on the king's most trusted ally. Until now, the punishment for poisoning had been hanging. But Henry VIII, furious at what he saw as an attack on the crown through his court, ordered Parliament to pass a new statute. Any person convicted of murder by poison would be boiled alive. No trial by jury could save Roos. He had been condemned by royal will, his fate sealed before the ink dried on the law. The guards came for him just after midday. Shackles rattled as he was led from the cell, up the stone steps into the pale light. His face was pale, but his eyes darted to the crowd already forming at Smithfield. Hundreds had gathered, merchants, beggars, apprentices, and even mothers clutching their children's hands. They came not only for justice, but for the morbid curiosity of seeing something England had never done before. In the center of the courtyard, the cauldron loomed like a black maw, already half filled with water. Beneath it, the fire roared, sending up waves of heat that shimmered in the cool air. The smell of smoke mingled with the metallic tang of the iron pot. Roos's wrists were bound in front of him now, the executioners gripping his arms tightly as they forced him toward the steps leading up to the scaffold that surrounded the boiling vat. A royal herald stepped forward, unrolling a parchment. In a loud, clear voice, he read the king's proclamation. Richard Roos, found guilty of murdering by poison, was to be boiled to death in water. Without benefit of clergy or sanctuary, the words hung in the air, and the crowd muttered. Some looked grim, others almost eager. The executioners moved quickly. One of them, wearing a leather apron to shield against splashes, tested the water with a long iron rod. It hissed as he withdrew it, the heat radiating in visible waves. Another man adjusted the chain suspended from a pulley above the cauldron. Roos glanced down into the swirling water, his breath quickening. They stripped him of his outer garments, leaving only a thin linen shirt. His skin prickled from the cold wind, but the real terror came from the furnace of heat in front of him. The first step onto the platform made him flinch. The wood itself was warm from the fire below. Without ceremony, the executioners lifted him by the arms and bound his ankles together with rope. He tried to resist, but the iron grip of the men on either side gave him no chance. Then, as the crowd hushed, he was hoisted by the pulley, swung out over the steaming vat. The first touch of heat against his feet made him thrash wildly, but the chains only let him drop further, inch by inch. The water licked up to his ankles, and the sizzle was audible over the crowd's murmurs. Steam curled up around his legs, clinging to his skin. The agony shot through him instantly. His feet reddened, blistering in seconds. A scream tore from his throat, high and sharp. The executioners held the pulley steady for a moment, letting him writhe. The crowd's front rows leaned forward, some covered their mouths, others stared unblinking. Then, with a slow crank, they lowered him deeper. The water reached his knees, and the blistering pain made his entire body convulse. The smell hit necks, cooked flesh, unmistakable and nauseating. The air filled with steam that carried the scent across the courtyard. A few in the crowd gagged and turned away, but most stayed. This was the king's justice, and no one dared speak against it. Ruse's voice cracked as he screamed again, but it was broken by gasps as the boiling water climbed his thighs. His shirt stuck to his back, damp from the steam. The executioners paused again, letting the heat torture him without drowning him in it too quickly. His head snapped back, his mouth open in a silent wail as the nerves in his legs burned out one by one. Minutes passed like hours. His hands gripped the chains until his knuckles whitened, but every movement only set fresh waves of pain. When the crank began to turn again, he shook his head violently, begging, though the words were barely coherent. The water reached his waist, and his skin there turned a deep, angry red, swelling and splitting in places where bubbles burst against him. His breathing came in ragged gasps, steam clouding around his face. Sweat poured down his brow, mingling with tears. The crowd's noise was a dull roar in his ears now, drowned out by the rushing blood in his head and the hiss of boiling water. At last, with one final crank, they lowered him to his chest. The shirt clung to him, cooking into his skin. His screams weakened into groans, his strength fading. Some witnesses later said they saw his skin sloughing off his arms like wet cloth. His eyes rolled back, and his head sagged forward. The executioners, following orders, kept him there. Boiling was meant to be slow, a punishment not just for the body but for the soul. It was nearly a quarter of an hour before he finally stopped moving, the water still bubbling violently around him. When they raised the body from the cauldron, the sight was too much for some. The limbs were twisted, the flesh blistered and pale in places, charred in others. Steam rose from the corpse as they cut it down, laying it on the scaffold. The smell lingered long after the crowd began to disperse. The day marked the first recorded execution by boiling alive under Henry VIII's new law. Richard Ruse's name would be remembered less for the crime than for the punishment. A man cooked to death by the king's command, in full view of London. The statute remained on the books for years, though few suffered his fate. But those who did would know the same slow, merciless end, their final moments spent in a cauldron of fire and water. And in the annals of English justice, April 5, 1531, stood as proof that when the crown demanded an example, it would deliver one the city would never forget. The wind carried the crackle of the fire, fanning the flames under the cauldron. Richard Ruse's groans were faint now, but every breath that escaped him rose in a cloud of steam that shimmered in the daylight. A woman in the crowd pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She'd come with her husband, who gripped her arm whenever she tried to turn away. "It's justice," he muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the scaffold. Remember that, not far from them, a group of young apprentices leaned on a cartwheel, their faces pale. They'd expected to see something swift, like a hanging or a beheading. Instead, they stood frozen as the water hissed against the man's blistered flesh. The sound was not loud, but it was constant, almost like the soft popping of fat in a pan. Closer to the front, an old man, a baker who had known Ruse from market days, clenched his jaw. He was quiet, the baker murmured to himself. Never thought. He trailed off, unable to finish. The executioners glanced toward the sheriff, waiting for his signal. The sheriff, a hard-faced man with a fur-lined cloak, simply nodded, slowly. They began to turn the crank again. The rope creaked as Ruse's limp body descended further, his chin now just above the bubbling surface. For a moment, his head jerked up again, eyes wide with renewed agony as the heat licked at his chest and shoulders. A strangled cry tore from his throat, not the sharp scream of earlier, but a raw, hoarse sound, as though the boiling itself had stolen his voice. A young boy near the front began to cry. His mother knelt quickly, turning his face into her skirts, whispering that it would be over soon. But the boy could still hear it, the dull, wet sound of water slapping against skin. Inside the cauldron, the water was no longer clear. A thin layer of pale, oily residue floated on the surface, and each bubble that burst sent tiny droplets onto the scaffold. One executioner, his face expressionless, wiped his apron with the back of his hand. The leather already speckled, the herald still standing with his parchment. spoke loudly over the crowd. Let all who witness know. This is the fate of the poisoner. Such is the king's mercy to those who break the peace by foul means. The word mercy drew a bitter laugh from somewhere in the crowd. The sheriff's eyes darted toward the sound, but he said nothing. This was a public warning as much as a punishment, and no one would forget it. Ruse's strength was almost gone. His hands loosened on the chains, fingers curling weakly. The executioners watched him carefully. They were to keep him alive as long as possible without letting him drown. It was a careful, deliberate cruelty, sanctioned at the highest level. From where he stood, a scribe dipped his quill and began to note the time. He had been ordered to record every detail for the royal court, not for pity, but so the king could hear exactly how long it took for the man to perish. Each movement, each sound, would be inked onto the page. Minutes dragged on. Ruse's head sank forward, steam curling through his hair. His skin, once red and blistered, had begun to turn pale and slack in places, as though the heat had stripped the life from it. Occasionally, his body twitched, small, involuntary spasms that made the surface ripple. At last, after what the scribe marked as 15 minutes, there was no more movement. The only sound was the hiss and pop of the water. Still, the sheriff held up his hand. Wait, they would give it another few moments to be certain. The fire would crack below, sending up another wave of heat. The crowd had fallen silent now, save for the shifting of feet and the occasional cough. The boy who had cried earlier was gone, his mother leading him away before the final lifting. When the sheriff finally nodded, the executioners began to crank the pulley. The chains groaned under the weight as Ruse's body rose slowly from the cauldron. Water streamed from his limbs, splattering onto the scaffold and hissing as it struck the hot iron frame. Gasps rose from the crowd. The man was hardly recognizable. The skin on his legs and torso blistered, peeling in places to reveal a deeper red beneath. His arms hung limp, fingers curled in unnatural angles. Steam still drifted from his form, curling in the cool air. They laid him onto a wooden platform. The planks darkened from the dripping water. One executioner leaned in, pressing a hand to the man's neck for formality's sake. Though it was clear he was gone, another took a blanket and draped it over the body. Though the outline of his twisted limbs still showed through the fabric, the sheriff stepped forward again. Let this be a lesson to all who would strike at God as anointed through treachery and poison, he declared. His voice was flat, the words practiced. This was not the first execution he had overseen. Though it was perhaps the most gruesome, the crowd began to break apart, people drifting toward the streets. Some walked quickly, eager to put distance between themselves and the smell. Others lingered, peering at the dark cauldron as though it might boil again of its own accord. The apprentices whispered to one another, their earlier bravado gone. As the scribe packed away his notes, he caught the eye of the old baker still standing near the front. The baker shook his head slowly. Never thought I'd see a man cook like meat, he muttered. By the time the scaffold was being dismantled, only a few remained. The fire was left to burn down on its own, and the cauldron cooled in the afternoon air. The water inside clouded and still. The execution of Richard Ruse was over. But in the taverns of London at night, the story was told over and over. How the cook was lowered slowly into the boiling pot. How his screams carried over the marketplace. How the king himself had ordered such a death. Some told it with horror, others with grim satisfaction. But one thing was certain. Anyone thinking of poison as a weapon would remember this day. The law was clear now. To take a life by such means was to forfeit your own in the most agonizing way possible. And somewhere in the Tower of London, the next prisoner awaited his fate, hearing only the whispers from the guards about the cook who had been boiled alive, and wondering if the king's cauldron would soon be lit again. This was not just an execution. It was a message burned into the memory of all who saw it. The king's justice was slow, deliberate, and meant to sear fear into every heart. In the history of human cruelty, being boiled alive stands as one of the most nightmarish punishments ever devised. And Richard Ruse's fate reminds us that in the medieval world, Death was never the worst thing that could happen to you.